Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ainhoa Montoya. I'm the director of the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies at the School of Advanced Study, University of London. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you to the conference on reimagining belonging in Latin America and beyond, access to citizenship, digital identity, and rights, which is hosted by the Center in collaboration with the Institute of Statelessness and Inclusion, which is a human rights NGO based in London and the Netherlands. And the conference is convened by Eve Hayes-de-Calaf, who is CLAC's stipendiary postdoctoral fellow, and from whom many of you will have already heard through email communication in the past few weeks. We were very pleased to see the significant response that the call for papers for this event got, and which led to turn to what initially was thought as a one-day event into a two-day event, including a fantastic array of interdisciplinary panels, a roundtable that will explore the issues of identity and belonging beyond the region of Latin America and the Caribbean, and a keynote address. And we are delighted that Wendy Hunter, who is professor of government at the University of Texas, Austin, accepted the invitation to deliver the keynote address, and she will be speaking by the end of today. We would, of course, have liked to welcome all of you in London, but the good news is that having it online, of course, allows for many of you to join us from different parts of the world. And some of you are joining us all the way down from Brazil, Australia, and the US. And we are grateful for the effort you are doing by joining us from different time zones. In terms of practicalities, we would appreciate it if you could make sure you're muted during the presentations. After all the presentations in each panel, there will be time for discussion and questions. And we would encourage you to use the chat to post comments and questions during or after the presentation, or even to introduce yourself and engage with others. And the questions and the comments will be picked up afterwards by the chair of the panel. But we would also welcome you to interact with your questions and use the raise hand function, which you will find under the participants panel. And the chair will ask you to unmute yourself when it is your turn. You can also feel free to ask a question in Spanish or Portuguese if you feel more comfortable using any of those languages. And you can post those questions perhaps in the chat. And well, as you know, we will be recording the talks and the keynote address, but not the Q&A. So we will be stopping the recording after the presentations. And finally, there will be breaks in between the panels. The Zoom link is going to be the same for all the event, and we will maintain it open. And during the breaks, we would ask everyone who's not a speaker to mute themselves and switch the camera off, and for speakers and chairs to join us 10 minutes before their panel and to switch their camera on. So I think that's everything from me. I hope you all enjoy the event and find it a very productive and rich conversation. And I'm now going to hand it over to Eve, who is going to briefly speak about how the idea of the conference emerged. So over to you, Eve.
Thank you so much, Ainhoa, and thank you, everybody. First and foremost, then, I would like to thank Linda Newson and, of course, Ainhoa Montoya for facilitating my fellowship at CLACS, and also for giving me the space to develop the idea for this conference, which has brought together and will continue to bring together many important speakers from around the world. Just in the chat just now, I've seen that we have people from joining us right now from Sydney, Amsterdam, Quito, Belgium, Estonia, Colombia, and Brazil, and a number of other places. So that's just wonderful to see that, to welcome you all. So the idea for this conference began in The Hague in 2014 when I was awarded a scholarship to attend the first Global Forum on Statelessness, which took place at the Peace Palace. Now, this event was organised by our co-host today, the Institute on Statelessness and Inclusion. And it really was the beginning of a really important and transformative journey that began with a number of discussions around questions of access to citizenship, identity and belonging. And it also led then my journey to complete my PhD, and also then to write my forthcoming book, which is out just after this summer, called Legal Identity, Race and Belonging in the Dominican Republic, from Citizen to Foreigner. So the idea for this conference and the synergies then I found with the people in The Hague. From these conversations, it was clear that, with the exception of the Dominican Republic, the region was largely absent from global discussions on the central themes that we'll be talking about today. And instead, it's regularly held up as a success story with regards to contemporary ID systems and efforts to tackle under registrations. But as we know, times are quickly changing. We're living in a post-pandemic world, and there is a greater need now to examine questions of digital identity rights, and to ask who of course are being included within these systems, but also perhaps more importantly, who are we excluding and why are they being excluded? And I'd also like to second Ainoa then in thanking our keynote speaker, Professor Wendy Hunter, who will be joining us later today, whose fantastic article, Documents Please, which was written alongside her colleague Robert Brill, really helped me shape the thinking for this conference and for my writing in general, to think about how we interact and how our identities interact with documents and bureaucratic systems and state architectures. So then please do use this space to reach out to one another, do exchange contact information and establish connections. Write to us as you are doing on the chat, please keep it up. And tell us where in the world you're from, what you're thinking, any ideas you've got, any collaborations you might want to make. We want the conference to be as interactive and collaborative as possible. If you're on social media, I've also put, we're using the hashtag reimagining belonging LATAM. I've put that in the chat for you, so please do share that with you when talking or tweeting about the conference. Now we're going to hear our first panel, which is Nation Building, National Identities and Belonging in the Americas, with our wonderful chair, Professor Peter Wade, and also our presenters, Shirley Jane Arenilla, Olga Lidia Saavedra Montes de Ochoa, and Jade Roberts, who are joining us from various locations around the world. So it's an absolute privilege then to welcome you all in this virtual format today and tomorrow. And I'd just like to say mil gracias, muito obrigada, and thank you to all. So Peter, please take it away.
Okay, thank you very much, Eve. Thanks, Ainoa, as well, for the invitation to chair this panel, which looks really interesting, and the whole conference looks very interesting as well. So we've got three speakers. They're all going to speak one after the other, and then there'll be a Q&A at the end. You each have 15 minutes, I believe that's right, isn't it? Yeah, okay. So since you're sharing your screen and you won't probably be able to see anything else very much, I will verbally interrupt you sort of when you've got about 5 minutes left, just to let you know where you are time-wise. Okay, so straight in then. Our first speaker is Shirley Jane Arenilla, who is an assistant professor of international law at Universidad del Norte in Barranquilla, Colombia. And she's also a distance learning PhD student in the law program at the University of Leicester. And she's going to, the title of her talk today is Nation Building, Race and Immigration in the Evolution of Post-Colonial Nationality Regimes in Hispanic America, the case of Colombia. Shirley, go ahead. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen. If you are kind enough to tell me if you are seeing it. Yeah. Okay. Hello to everybody. Thank you, Professor Wade, for your introduction, and thank you to the chair, to the organizers of the conference, and also to the other panelists, and my regards, and to the assistants. Well, as Professor Wade said, I will be talking today about nation building, race, and immigration in the evolution of the post-colonial nationality regimes in Hispanic America, with an emphasis in the case of Colombia. For my presentation, I will be explaining my research question and doing some context with an introduction, to then move to the relationship between nation building, race, and immigration, and how those factors connect with nationality. And finally, I will present in the case of Colombia, and I will offer some conclusions. With regard to my research question, I I'm trying to answer what historical factors explain the emergence and development of jus soli regimes in Hispanic America and Colombia. And this is a question that I am trying to answer in my PhD research, in which I am aiming to study the evolution of the Colombian nationality regime over time, to understand the effects of international migration in the acquisition of nationality by birth for children of foreigners. This is taking a global South perspective, because when we talk about determinants in the evolution of nationality regimes, the scholarship is focused on countries, on global North countries, especially Western Europe, and not in global South countries, because global South countries are considered countries of emigration and not countries of immigration, and that's why countries in the global South are left out of this kind of research. So to offer some context about my presentation, I want to start showing this map where the blue part is or are the countries in the Americas who apply unconditional jus soli. And we can see that most countries in Hispanic America apply unconditional jus soli. Mexico, almost all Central America, or all Central America, and this part of South America. But we see this gray spot here is Colombia, and Colombia does not. So this means that most children born in the Hispanic American countries acquire the nationality of their place of birth without distinction of the nationality of their parents or their migratory status. And in Colombia, when children are born in Colombia, they are or acquire Colombian nationality if their parents are nationals, or if their parents are foreigners when they are domiciled in the country. Currently, Colombia became a country of immigration, mostly because it's receiving migrants and refugees from Venezuela. And this difference in the nationality regime that I just explained created a problem for the acquisition of Colombian nationality for children of Venezuelans born in Colombia. This led to a discussion about the concept of domicile, and also to the related risk of statelessness. So in this, with this framework, I asked myself why Colombia does have a nationality regime that is so different from all Hispanic American countries, considering that Colombia has the same language, the same or similar legal traditions, the similar colonial past. And I found that in the literature about determinants in the evolution of the nationality regimes, we find nation building, colonial past, levels of immigration pressure as factor to determine that evolution. So that's how I came with the study of nation building in Hispanic America and Colombia, and I found that they were related to race and immigration. So to talk about the relationship between nation building, race, and immigration, I have to first define nation building. And a short concept about nation building is, for me, the construction of an imagined community, borrowing the term imagined community from Benedict Anderson, who wrote a book with the same name. So the question is, what was the imagined community in Hispanic America in the 19th century? And to answer this question, we must consider that after independence, Hispanic American countries found themselves in a multiracial society where you find that there was the criollos or children of Spaniards born in the Americas, African descendants, indigenous communities, mixed population, and the elites that were the criollos were the elites at that time. They thought that the Mayan community needed to be a racially homogeneous population. And for them, the idea was to achieve that, to bring a European immigration with the aim of whitening or what we call in Spanish blanqueamiento, and civilizing the country. So this idea of whitening, what was that? It was an idea of de-Indianize and de-Africanize the population through immigration. We also must understand that during the colony, the society was divided in caste according to race, and that whiteness was associated with positive concepts such as civilization. After independence or after colonialism, the Hispanic American countries then maintained that racialized framework in which they thought that the only way to achieve progress and civilization was through European immigration and also an cohesive national identity. So the other question is, how does a factor connect with nationality? And I think the answer here is that nationality or the attribution of nationality is a key element or a key aspect in the nation building process of any country. Nationality is a legal status that allows individuals to be fully integrated into a political community and to participate in its affairs. So legal and political participation are essential to the creation of a nation. Here, there is the point in which nationality then becomes a mechanism of inclusion and exclusion. Why? Because when individuals are part of, or are nationals of a country, they are part of a nation to the exclusion of others, the foreigners, with the consequences such exclusion might bring to their admission, permanence, or exit of the country. Therefore, nation building connected with race and with immigration can be considered determinants in the formation and evolution of the nationality regime, as nationality became a legal tool to include or exclude immigrants and their children from the political community. In the case of Colombia, the aim of the government was the integration of the European immigrants through the rules of naturalization and the incorporation of their children born in the country as nationals by birth. This, of course, was not exclusive of Colombia. Many Hispanic American countries, if not all, after independence and after the Haitian Revolution and the Wars of Independence, engaged in discussions about race, nation, and citizenship. And the elites assigned nationality and citizenship to the groups, the racial groups they thought were more convenient for the construction of the nation. And this also was in line with another thought, that it was that the groups, the racial groups that did not fit in that imaginary, they were to be eliminated through the process of miscegenation, mixed to races. With these two variables, the adoption of a jus soli regime was or made sense, because it made nationals or children's nationals, from children that were children of desirable immigrants and desirable races, and the other racial groups that did not fit in that imaginary, they were to be assimilated over time. In regard to the case of Colombia, I bring this table to show the interplay between nationality, immigration, and nation building. And we can see that the regime in Colombia in the post-independence period between 1821 to 1843, the nationality was attributed only to free men born in the country. That
Shirley,
yes,
I have about 4 minutes left.
Okay, thank you. I will try to be as fast as I can. So here we see the groups that were excluded: European Spaniards, African descendants, because European Spaniards because they were not born in the country, and the Criollos first they were they would oppose to independence, and African descendants because they were not free, and they were the most excluded group in the whole thing. Indigenous communities and mixed populations were part of the nationality regime, but they had restricted political rights. In 1853, the regime changed, and what we see is that this is in line with the immigration policies of the time. It was designed to attract and retain European immigrants. And for instance, Asian immigrants were left out. They were considered impossible to integrate in the society and a form of cheap labor, but no more. And in 1863, the immigration project failed. What we see is that the policy was a policy of selection of immigrants according to their race, to their nationality, and other conditions, and that left out children of those non-selected immigrants, and also the regime then excluded non-domiciled individuals born in the country to foreigners. So the nationality regime seems to be neutral, but in reality, there are racial considerations behind it. So to conclude, the study of the Colombian nation building process indicates its influence in the formation and the evolution of the nationality regime, as the central idea was that European immigrants will aid the process of modernization of the country and will contribute to national cohesion by widening a population of African and indigenous communities. In this context, the adoption of a EU-solid regime makes sense because together with flexible rules of naturalization, it was part of the strategy to attract and retain immigrants. The other conclusion that I can offer is that despite the similarity in the nation building debates and race and immigration, Colombia had a different outcome in regard to the regulation of nationality because it introduced the requirement of domicile as a qualification for the acquisition of nationality by birth. Well, that's it, and thank you all to listen to my presentation.
Thank you very much, Shirley. That's very interesting. So let's move on now to our second speaker, who is Olga Lidia Saavedra Montes de Oca, who has a PhD in creative and critical practice from the University of Sussex, which he did on visual ethnography with transgender people in Cuba. She's now a research associate in the School of Media, Film and Music, also at the University of Sussex, and she's a visiting fellow of the Centre for Latin American and Caribbean Studies at the school at the University of London. So, Olga, go ahead, please.
Okay, I was saying that thank you to everyone that made possible the conference. And I was relating that because we got only 15 minutes, I'm not gonna be reading the proposal, the abstract, which I think most of you are familiar with by now, but I'm gonna be stressing the main point of my presentation, which title is From Savior Citizen to Traitor, an exploration of national identity and belonging through healthcare professionals. As is well known, Cuban health system and its medical advancement have contributed to shape its national and global identity, and we have created both national and international reputation, while also shaping the social and political identity of its healthcare practitioner. We focus on the experience of the Cuban healthcare, an example from Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela very briefly. This paper is going to be analyzing how national identity and citizenship are conditioned by political ideology and power. And online with this also is an approach to understand how Cuban healthcare professional identity is also contingent to their political ideology. So I'm gonna start now by locating myself in relation to what is going to be discussed here. And it's mainly in relation to how important it is for us to keep relocating our position every time that we talk about identity, citizenship, and belonging. And how we change not only in relation to where we come from, but also where we are now in terms of race, culture, class, religion, gender, sexuality, and also how those identities keep changing all the time. So I say that in order to state my position in relation to the Cuban relation in relation to the US blockade. So I'm not in favor of the US blockade, and I'm not in favor of any foreign interference in Cuba's domestic affairs. It's important to make that statement because we know all the polarized discussion when we are entering the debate that include Cuba, and also we are in relation with a lot of polarization in global debate. I also could say that I am anti-imperialist, but what I'm doing living here in England, so this is a way to questioning and understanding my position in relation to the debate of citizenship and belonging. As a Latin American scholar, also, I think that we need to both pay attention to nationalism and ideology simultaneously and how it affects identity story. In the Cuban case, the predominant Cuban national identity story is that of human solidarity and altruism and loyalty. My reflection is in line with scholars exploring nationalism as an ideology, not only as loyalty to the state or the nation, but also about humanity and about family. And this is in line with my work on family. Is connected as well as a way that the Cuban identity is built and how it affects, in this case, to the Cuban health practitioner. So a common identity, the nation, while recognizing and respecting and accommodating diversity in our society. So one of the three main aspects that I want to recreate here is not necessarily about making statements, but about problematizing narrative of citizenship, belonging, human rights in relation to the Latin American and Caribbean context. Also, is in relation to problematize otherness in relation to belonging and citizenship and also migration, because I think we are very familiar with exploring otherness and belonging always allocated to a specific body. So I want to explore that analysis in identities of body that they are not necessarily undocumented, or they are not necessarily on the border of marginalization. Also, I want to make complex and explore the very contradictory ways in which identity exists and experienced in the Latin American and Caribbean context. So in terms of literature and context, I was exploring and taking into account from many of the way that nation has been explored and discussed. So here are just one or few of the ones that I feel connected and help me to build this analysis in relation to the Cuban nation. So the first one is in relation to nationalism and revolution as a collective mental attitude that are formed through expression and action. The other way of understanding nation is in relation to the combination of several kinds of objective relationships, and they can be cultural, religious, geographical, or historical, and how they are subjective in relation to reflection and collective conscious. And in this case, is in the way to analyze the Cuban health system, not as a body of work just linked to the state, but the protagonists of those stories are necessarily in need to be understood and analyzed and their lives put on context. This is why I'm talking here in relation to nation, spirituality, and principle. And here also there is the word of G. Costa, which helped me a lot to understand and interrogate nation, and how most of the time this has been built in relation to nationalism and bit moment in history. And doing that is suppressing different overriding minority voice, which in this case associating with the work of, or the life of the Cuban care practitioner. Another word that was central to that was the word of Candice, and in relation to the centrality of the healthcare to Cuban nationalism and how it contributes to the country's identity. And also the work of Panichelli, which has been central in my work also. And it helped me to analyze and understand the debate in relation to the Cuban healthcare, their mission, and how it has been criticized for some people and some scholars, and also praising for other scholars. So this is briefly kind of a visual map and to help us visualize the many countries in which Cuban doctors are spread and serving and using their humanitarian labor. It says that since mid-2020, the state-run press acknowledged that overseas medical missions are one of the Cuban government's main source of income. And in only 2018, Cuba earned 6.4 billion pesos in social and health export. And is this date the double the income from tourism according to official figure. So this is just a visual image, and they are taken from official source and Facebook, official source from Facebook. And you can see it's an image that we are visually connected, and we know about the Cuban doctor abroad. And this is another.
Olga.
Yeah.
You have about 5 minutes left.
Okay, thank you, thank you. And so then, all these indicators, which is explored in the work of Johnson, in which he said that most of the factors that identify the Cuban identity, they might threaten about emerging inequality in relation to health risks that are associated with economy and the expansion of tourism. So in my analysis, I'm thinking about what is missing here. So what is missing here is the analysis of the people with mission and protagonists as being part of this narrative of nation building. So here we got the experience of Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Brazil. And the idea to put all these visual narratives together is just because in some way Brazil is different in terms of ideology in comparison with Nicaragua and Venezuela, but the situation in which the doctors are placed now, mainly the doctor that has deserted from the mission, they are in the same position as the sector aided as a traitor, which I'm saying here, they are not deserters, neither they are traitors, but probably they are the political order. So here we got doctors that they were deserted from Brazil after Bolsonaro came into power for different disagreement between the Cuban government. Here we got another nation building identity in relation to Venezuela. And here we got another approach that some people have in relation to the Cuban daughter that are placed in Nicaragua. So how coming from those narratives of being savior to being traitor? I'm going here to analyze that the link of United States in relation to Cuban identity has affected us to understand the internal factors that are interfering and let's say that are distracting the Cuban national identity. Here we got a few regulating that has been in place for the Cuban government in relation to the doctor, which are called población regulada. So they are the Resolution 54, the Resolution 160, in which the Cuban doctors that are leaving the mission are not allowed to come into the country for 8 years. And Cuban doctors that are in the country, they are not allowed to leave the country because their status as a citizen are regulated. So here, this just reconocimiento and this diploma just briefly allow me to understand and use the same word, computer, internet, as a possibility to send a message. So this is why I'm using Facebook data, internet data, account from the people that has been experiencing this discrimination which affect belonging and citizenship to explore this narrative. Using Facebook, using the press, using the account from this doctor that has been criticized and has been separated from their post because their criticism to the Cuban state. And this is a case of doctor in Cuba. This is the case of another doctor outside the Cuba with their mission was interrupting again because criticizing the health system and the Cuban health representing the mission. So how their ideology has been affected and how their citizenship and their mission have been affected because the political ideology. So one of the questions that I'm been asking is how stripping Cuban health practitioners from the right as a Cuban doctor identity can affect their human rights, can affect access to benefit, access to service, and access to financial independence, and political participation, and also as a mode of more reflection, which is implying more question, I asking, is the situation of the health professional and technician a humanitarian crisis? Is the separation of the Cuban family as a result of this immigration regulation of the healthcare practitioner is a violation of human rights? Are those doctors still savior or traitor? And in this case, who make this sentence? Sorry that has been rushing, but I think it's done. Thank you.
Thank you very much,
Thank
Olga.
you.
Very interesting.
Thank you.
Okay, let's move on. So our third and final speaker for this panel is Jade Roberts, who has a background in law, specifically international law. She's now a PhD student, at the Peter McMullen Centre on Statelessness in the University of Melbourne. And she's going to talk about manufacturing foreigners, law and politics of transforming citizens into migrants. Jade, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Peter, for that introduction. And thank you very much also to Eve and to CLACS and to ISI for the opportunity to participate in and to present in this conference. It's really a privilege for me to be here and to be presenting with you and to also be hearing all of the presentations over these 2 days. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm talking to you today or this evening, as it is in Melbourne, from the lands of the Windrish people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional owners of the land on which I live. And I'd like to acknowledge and to pay my respects to Wurundjeri elders, past, present and emerging, and to acknowledge that their sovereignty over this land was never ceded. So I'm presenting on a chapter which is titled Manufacturing Foreigners, the Law and Politics of Transforming Citizens into Migrants. And it's a chapter that I've co-written with Michelle Foster, who is the director of the Peter McMullen Centre on Statelessness at the University of Melbourne. So I'm also presenting on Michelle's behalf today. This chapter has been published in the Research Handbook on the Law and Politics of Migration, edited by Catherine Deverne, which came out just earlier this year, in case you like to read it. So let me begin by giving an overview of my presentation. So first, I'm going to briefly describe the background to our topic and our research questions. Then I'm going to mention the methodology and explain the legal and the political processes of manufacturing foreigners that we examined. But I'm going to focus on our key findings, and these relate to the elasticity of legal categories, the complicity of legal institutions, and the contestability of citizenship. And I'm going to end by discussing areas for future research, in particular, 2 challenges for international human rights law in constraining this practice. So, Michelle and I were interested in this increasingly prevalent practice of states using laws and legal mechanisms to transform citizens who often constitute racial, religious and ethnic minorities into foreigners, and in the process making them stateless. So these forms of mass denationalisation haven't been seen since the Second World War, and they differ from another resurging phenomenon, that of the citizenship stripping of so-called foreign fighters, which involves denationalisation of individuals who are considered a national security threat. As these individuals are often dual citizens, denationalisation in that case doesn't leave them stateless. So in this chapter, we compare 2 examples of this practice: the seminal case of the Dominican Republic's denationalisation of citizens of Haitian descent, and the citizenship verification exercise being carried out in the state of Assam in India. But other examples of this practice include Myanmar's treatment of the Rohingya and Ethiopia's denationalisation of citizens of Eritrean descent. And we can put this phenomenon in an even broader context, that of an inward shifting border, so that citizenship law has become the final border site for the exclusion of foreigners. Our research questions in this chapter were the following. What is the role of law in making citizens stateless? How do the legal and the political dimensions of these processes intersect? What consequence does this practice have for the nature and value of citizenship? And what role can human rights law play in constraining this practice? So, turning to the methodology and the object of study. This chapter is a comparative analysis based on desk-based research into the laws, legislation and case law in the Dominican Republic and in India. And we also draw on literature on citizenship, belonging and identity from the fields of law, political science and sociology. Now, I'm sure that many of you are very familiar with the denationalisation process in the Dominican Republic, and I've just outlined the key elements of it here. But to explain briefly the citizenship verification exercise known as the National Register of Citizens in India. So this was a process introduced in the state of Assam, which has historically received large-scale immigration from neighbouring Bangladesh, and in which there has been a strong anti-immigrant and anti-Muslim sentiment. And the process required all residents of Assam to provide documentary proof that they or their parents had been living there prior to 1971, which is the year of establishment of Bangladesh. The final list or the final register omitted 1.9 million residents, leaving them at risk of statelessness. Regularisation legislation was introduced in 2019, but only in respect of non-Muslim residents. So let me turn now to our key findings. The first is the elasticity of legal categories. So in both cases, legal categories were interpreted in a way that excluded a minority group for the benefit of the majority. In the Dominican Republic, this meant that long-established residents of Haitian descent were deemed by the state to be foreigners through a reinterpretation of a legal category. So to explain this further, the category foreigners in transit had initially and logically been interpreted to refer only to travellers, so people transiting through the country or having a short-term stay. But through legislative amendment, constitutional change and court decisions, this category was expanded to include migrant workers. A second and related key finding is that courts have been complicit in the manufacturing of foreigners in three ways. They have reflected political rhetoric, they have galvanised and legitimised political and bureaucratic processes, and they have resisted claims about individual rights and international norms. So let's look at these in turn. So both countries are democracies with independent courts, yet the reasoning of the courts mirrors the political rhetoric in the countries in significant ways. So when this denaturalisation process came before the Dominican Constitutional Court, it observed that there are large numbers of foreigners in the Dominican Republic who would like to get nationality, and most of them are undocumented Haitian nationals. They also said the applicant is just one of over 600,000 other people. Even more explicitly in India, the Supreme Court used the language of influx, saying that the state of Assam would ultimately be swamped and that a huge number of illegal migrants were incorrectly, in their view, deemed to have been citizens of India. So these statements reflect a concern about opening the floodgates to other applicants and being overwhelmed by so-called illegal immigrants that mirrored the political discourse in the two countries. So not only did courts reflect political rhetoric, they also strengthened and they lent legitimacy to the ongoing bureaucratic and political processes. So one order made by the Constitutional Court in the Dominican Republic was for the Central Electoral Board, which is a civil registry office, to perform an audit of all births since 1929 to identify, in their words, foreigners who had been illegally registered. Similarly, the Indian Supreme Court ordered the expedition and finalisation of the process of identifying so-called illegal immigrants, and they also ordered talks to commence with Bangladesh about their deportation. So in both cases, the courts furthered these denationalisation processes and also in doing so lent them an air of legitimacy. And finally, on the complicity of legal institutions, in neither case did the court frame the issue of denationalisation in terms of individual rights. So in the Dominican Republic, although the Constitutional Court had accepted the admissibility of the case on the basis that fundamental rights were involved, it went on to characterise the issue as one concerning the rights of the state, concluding that it was the denationalisation process did not constitute an arbitrary deprivation of the right to nationality. On the contrary, it was a legitimate act of sovereignty. And then very similarly, the Indian Supreme Court didn't discuss the individual rights of those who were left off the register. Instead, it focused on the collective right of the state of Assam, framing the whole verification exercise as a protection against a foreign influx or an external aggression against the state. Additionally, in both cases, the courts were resistant to international and regional human rights norms. So in the Dominican Republic, the court referred to a decision that had been made by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, which found that this process had violated the right to a nationality and the obligation of non-discrimination. But the Constitutional Court dismissed the significance of this case, saying that the state had complete discretion in matters of nationality. And the Indian Supreme Court didn't even refer to any of India's relevant international human rights obligations, perhaps reflecting an assumption that the matter was entirely one of state discretion. And then so to our third key finding, the contestability of citizenship.
Jade,
you've
got 5 minutes left.
Lovely, thanks, Peter. So in both cases, we see a shift away from jus soli or birthright citizenship to jus sanguinis or descent or bloodlines as the basis of citizenship. And this is part of a broader trend away from birthright citizenship among countries that have a history of colonisation, mass migration, and racial or religious persecution or discrimination. And in both cases, in both countries, the Dominican Republic and India, these denationalisation processes have been accompanied by efforts to increase the rights of the diaspora, reflecting a strengthening of the idea of citizenship based on descent. Secondly, we know that theories of citizenship often argue that citizenship as legal status or thin citizenship is something that is secure, in contrast to thick conceptions of citizenship like belonging and identity, which are contestable and the subject of debate. But these case studies show that there are populations whose legal status can be manipulated and be revoked. So citizenship as legal status can be just as insecure as other dimensions of citizenship. And then finally, these cases contribute to the idea of documentary citizenship. They show the increasing value placed upon the scrutiny of documents and the need to prove one's identity, but they also show that documents are becoming increasingly tenuous markers of citizenship, which must be subject to continual scrutiny to prove their evidentiary value. So I want to conclude by discussing areas for future research. There are two areas of uncertainty in the degree to which international human rights law, and in particular the International Covenant on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, which is the most relevant treaty, can restrain this process of manufacturing foreigners. The first area of uncertainty is the degree to which the intersecting grounds of discrimination at play in these case studies, so race, ethnicity, and religion, can be addressed through human rights treaties, which focus on single grounds of discrimination. For example, there's no mention of religion in the Isird. There have been some statements from the committee saying that the treaty extends to other grounds, but we think that clear guidance on this point in the form of a general recommendation would be helpful. The second area of uncertainty is ambiguity within Isird on matters of racial discrimination in respect of nationality. So I'm referring here to the interplay between the Article 5 obligation to eliminate racial discrimination in respect of the right to nationality and this carve-out that exists for matters of nationality and citizenship in Article 1, paragraph 3. And I'll let you just read that provision. So if you're interested in this puzzle of the relationship between these two provisions, I'll end by noting that Michelle has examined this further in this article. And if you're writing on this issue of discrimination and nationality laws, I just wanted to highlight this call for papers for a special issue of the International Journal of Discrimination and the Law on the topic of undoing discriminatory borders. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Jade. That was perfect timing.
Welcome back to Reimagining Belonging in Latin America and Beyond, Access to Citizenship, Digital Identity and Rights. I'm Shtona Kettle, lecturer at Universidad San Francisco de Quito and doctoral student at the Institute of the Americas, University College London. So I'm very pleased and excited to be chairing this panel titled Unlocking Citizenship Rights, Indigenous, Afro-descended and Religious Identities. And this panel is designed to unearth some of the challenges that Indigenous, Afro-descendant and religious communities face in the Americas. And we have three excellent panelists who will have 15 minutes each to present their papers, after which time there will be room for questions and comments. And very similar to the format of the last panel, please do write any questions or comments that you have in the chat box. If you wish to be anonymous, you can send me your question or comment to me privately in the chat function. So we will hear the presentations in succession, and I will present each speaker before they are about to present. Let's move on to our next panelist then. So to be or not to be Indigenous, that is the Brazilian question, is the title of our next panelist, Ryan de Salas Lima's presentation. Ryan is a master's student at the Department of Political Science at the Federal University of Minas Gerais, Brazil. And she also works at the Brazilian Federal Agency for Indigenous Policy. There, she works on policies to ensure the participation of Indigenous peoples, particularly women and children, in the decision-making processes of the Brazilian government. Her research focuses on public policies for children and Indigenous youth and ethnic and racial identity. So, Ryan, please go ahead with your presentation.
Well, hi everyone. My presentation is to be or not to be Indigenous. That's a Brazilian question. Well, in Brazil, there are 305 Indigenous ethnicity who speak 274 different languages, and many of them don't speak Portuguese. Indigenous people make up less than 1% of Brazil's population. They are all over the country, live in a big city, in a small town, and indigenous land, which make up about 13% of Brazil's territory. Each indigenous ethnicity and even each community within an ethnicity has a specific organization and has a distinct relationship with the environment, the land, and the other societies. In the past, the diversity of indigenous people in Brazil was significantly bigger. It's estimated that in the 16th century, the indigenous population was 3 million people, falling to less than half 70 years after the arrival of the Portuguese. In the mid-20th century, this population was completely exterminated, reaching around 70,000 people. Currently, the indigenous population is around 900,000 people. Well, what happened? Although part was physically killed, another part was legally exterminated. The Brazil state promotes policies that result in symbolic death of indigenous person. The person is still alive, but his indigenous identity was no longer recognized. This action has a strong connection with interest in indigenous land. Since the 5th century, Brazil has understood that land traditionally occupied by indigenous people will always belong to them. regardless of ownership registration. This right is known as the original principle of indigenato. But if the community is not indigenous, well, they can only live on the land if it had the proper registration, and that's where the controversy lies. The first legislation that authorized the government to question indigenous identity was the Land Act in 1815, which determined that all lands without owner belong to the states. Only lands with registration and lands occupied by the indigenous community were considered lands with owner. The Land Act created the Mediation and Demarcation Commission, which went to communities to verify they are indigenous or not. And for community to be considered indigenous, it could not have any elements from outside its culture. By the end of the 19th century, about 19% of the non-indigenous population of northeast region of Brazil had been classified as caboclo, mixes. This population had their lands taken away, the tradition is prohibited, and their identity erased. In the 70s, the Brazilian military regimes tried to implement its colonization project in the Amazon and intensify action to remove the ethnic identity of indigenous people. During the military regimes, the state interested in being or not being indigenous became a mark of exclusion of rights. This action had a disastrous consequence for indigenous people. The National Truth Commission in 2014 reported that military government considered indigenous people obstacle to Brazilian development, and to make the modernization plan viable, the government did not shy away from committing multiple violations against indigenous people with the seal of the legislation. The main instrument of the military regime was the Indigenous People Statute, which legally established outside identification as a state policy. In this case, an outside group would have to confirm someone's indigenous identity for the person to be indigenous. Anthropological reports were used by the state as a certificate of identity. This situation creates serious land conflicts that, to this day, are unresolved. In the democratization of Brazil in 1988, indigenous persons were considered citizens. From then on, the resurgence of communities they had their identity cancelled by the Brazilian state started to grow. In 2003, the National Foundation for Indigenous People, FUNAI, the Brazilian federal agency responsible for indigenous policy, determined the end of the use of anthropological report to certify the identity of indigenous people. From then on, each ethnicity had the autonomy to establish its own identity. But even after Brazil's ratification of Indigenous and Tribal People Convention in 2004, the C-169, indigenous community faced the obstacle to have access to constitutionally guaranteed rights. This convention established the self-determination of the people as a pillar, but the Brazilian state did not establish a way to respond to demands for the rights without basing them on ethnic identification. Denial of civil documents, difficult to access in health services, and no demarcation of indigenous lands. The example of a situation result from this problem. Although FUNAI understood the self-identification was enough to indigenous people have access to specific policy, historically the agency has done little to assist communities that are claiming the rights via identification of the ethnic identities. In Brazil's current presidency, conflict between the states and indigenous people have intensified, and to be or not to be indigenous return as a matter of state interest. And this year, in January, the FUNAI published the Act number 4 that's defining new specific terms for outside identification that will be observed by FUNAI, aimed to improve the protection of indigenous people and individuals for the execution of public policy. In practice, this act reaffirmed the state's power to determine the identity of indigenous people and makes possible the exploration of the lands. The action number 4 was criticized by indigenous organizations, the prosecutor's office, and also by FUNAI's own civil servant union. The Federal Supreme Court suspended the act, arguing that it is illegal, as FUNAI should not have the power to create rules for the identification of indigenous people. This issue, the issue of ethnic identity in Brazil, has been closely related to land ownership. And since the colonial times, lately, tension between the government and indigenous people had been increased. The interest in the exploration of indigenous land had provoked reaction, such as the Act number 4. The anthropologist Viveiro de Castro says that in Brazil, everyone is an indigenous, except those who are not. I have a coworker who says, in Brazil, currently, no one is indigenous, even who is. In the end, to be or not to be indigenous remain Brazilian questions. Thank you.
An excellent presentation, Chayan. Thank you very much. Our final speaker then is Manuela Carpenedo, who is a fellow of the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies at School of Advanced Study, and she's a social scientist and ethnographer. Her interests focus on topics related to religious dynamics in Latin America, the anthropology of Christianity, sociology of religion, and geopolitics of faith. The title of her presentation is Imagined Communities, Religious Revivals, and Emerging Crypto-Jewish Identities Among Evangelicals. The case of the Judaizing evangelicals in Brazil. Please go ahead, Manuela.
Thank you so much. The title is this idea of imagined communities, the crypto-Jewish identities, mapping out how ethnogenesis and religion are crossing here in Brazil. And it's great that we just had Ryan's questions that connect with what I'm going to say as well. Well, brief outline of my presentation. I will explore a bit the Judaizing evangelicals, which is the group of it's a religious group that I studied in Brazil. And then I will move for the ideas recovering these B'nai Anusim Marrano identities, these crypto-Jewish identities within Brazil. Then here I wonder, is this a case of purposeful ethnogenesis, what is going on in terms of religion and ethnicity? Then I will start talking and exploring the idea of mestiçagem, multiculturalism, and what I found being this longing for an ethnic identity now in post-multicultural Brazil. Well, a bit of the Judaizing evangelicals. I've worked with the community. It's a growing number of religious communities in Brazil that they are embracing a kind of a mix between Christianity and Judaism. So they were all Pentecostals before the move towards Judaism. So this is kind of a movement that is growing in the world. You have similar things going on in North America in terms of the Christian Zionists. You have the Messianic Jews. But here in Brazil, something else is happening. You have former Pentecostals now embracing many of the lifestyles and the taboos of Orthodox Jews. And you have, I examined, so for 2 years, from 2013 to from 2015, from 2013, 2015, I did this ethnography, trying to understand what was going on in terms of why these Pentecostals were becoming Jews, basically living like Jews. So, and I found this unique entanglement between Christianity and Judaism, and they have the kind of more the theological background, the belief in Jesus with this kind of all the laws of Judaism. So in terms of Judaism, and this is the community is gradually adopting all that. They are adopting all the kashrut, so the dietary laws, the family purity laws, in terms of taboos regarding menstruation, women, the modesty rules. So all the women, they just respected strict modesty codes, male circumcision, Shabbat. So you have all this community really going towards a more kind of observant Orthodox Jewish lifestyle. Of course, that Christianity is very important to them. That's why they are in this between of Christianity and Judaism. So they believe in Jesus as the Messiah. They read the New Testament, but alongside Talmudic literature, you have Paul is completely ignored within their theology. And I also observed the important role of Jesus in their understandings. Yeah, but how can we understand why this is going on? What this former Brazilian charismatic evangelicals, why they are just incorporating all these Jewish laws and Jewish lifestyles? Well, here I have a twofold answer. I will just briefly touch on part of my argument, and then I will move to the kind of crypto-Jewish one. Well, and this is one of the main tropes of this group, is that they are trying to reform Christianity. So they are very upset by neo-Pentecostal churches in Brazil. Especially, you have what they call like kind of move of secularization of charismatic evangelicalism. You have even in more conservative Pentecostal churches. I remember the informant saying, "Oh, now even if you are crente, even if you are a believer, you see them just wearing trousers and dyeing their hair." So they were not happy with this move toward a more kind of relaxed lifestyle. Prosperity gospel. So they are really trying to reject all the past kind of teachings on how, in terms of prosperity gospel, basically teaches you if you give money to the church, you can receive back. And this is complicated for this group here. So they were not happy in their former churches that they were practicing all this kind of teachings. You have a whole supernatural elements, the spiritual warfare, which really characterize Brazilian neo-Pentecostalism, and a whole kind of demonization of Afro-diasporic religions. So all this kind of elements of warfare and exorcism, deliverance, they're really trying to reject, when they are embracing this Jewish-like lifestyle. And the weak theological content that they found in this neo-Pentecostal and Pentecostal churches. So from there, they understood that, okay, the kind of the roots of Christianity is somehow in Judaism, and they were now they are in the process of embracing all these laws and lifestyle. Okay, and here I explore this. This is part of it's one chapter of my book that was just published. Then I can give more information about that. And I try to work why Judaism and why this ethnic identity, because although it's not like the main a reason why they are Judaizing, why they are just embracing that, as I just said, they are very unhappy with Pentecostal churches. There is this kind of ethnic elements in terms of recovering a certain Jewish heritage, a crypto-Jewish identity. And this is what I'm going to dive here now. So I wonder here, how could we understand this unexpected ethnic identification with Jews and Judaism, and why Brazil and why now? So and here I will try to avoid just like arguments on cultural appropriation and this, and trying to move with my subjects and see why they see that they are somehow connected with this Jewish memory. So the group I study, there is this important aspect that they claim that they have somehow a Jewish connection or a Jewish kind of heritage. They invoke this experience through the recovered Jewish collective memory and these crypto-Jewish practices. And they link with a remote B'nai Anusim Marrano past. And this is somehow is connected. This is why one of the reasons why they have chosen basically Judaism instead of any other kind of conservative trend in terms of religion. So I will explain what are the B'nai Anusim, what are the Marranos. Here I have a map in order to illustrate a bit that. So the Marranos, the B'nai Anusim, and in Brazil we also know as os cristãos novos, new Christians, cristãos novos. They were the Jews from the Iberia. They were the Sephardic Jews. So you had the temple, second temple being destroyed in Israel. And then you have the Jews, the Sephardic Jews going to the Iberian Peninsula. And then from there, we spend many centuries there. And then you have the golden age of Jewish thought and all that. And from there, you have the they were expelled from the Iberian Peninsula during the Inquisition, around late 16th, 17th century. And many of them, they went, and here you have in the map, you have the streams of this migratory flow. So, and historical research actually shown that Brazil received many new Christians, being like crypto-Judaism. So Jews that, of course, that many of them, they had to convert to Catholicism. Otherwise, they were just being arrested by the Inquisition or even persecuted. So what you have the phenomenon of crypto-Judaism, in which people would confess a Christian identity, but within their private life, they would follow the laws in terms of dietary laws, women's menstrual taboos, and all that. So since this was basically private, no one could tell, no. So and all these ideas are somehow connected with the narratives that I found in some of the people I worked with and I interviewed. So in my field work, I heard many stories of people, personal connections with Judaism from serious genealogical research. And here I had the opportunity to speak with many of them doing serious genealogical research, and also dreams or divine kind of revelations connecting them to Judaism. So, and this, we have many kind of crypto-Jewish practices that people would just say, oh, my grandma, we used to do this, we used to kill an animal like that, like the Jews, like taking off the blood and all that. So here I have some. This is one of my informants telling how in her house they would just keep kosher in a way. So her mom would just prepare and kill the animals in a certain way, and also take out all the blood. And when she confronted with her husband, she didn't know that she was different. So all this kind of small kind of crypto-Jewish practices that some of my informants, they were telling me and just saying that they used to practice in their private house. So we have this individual kind of narratives, but also the community mobilized in a more kind of a collective way, these narratives in terms of connecting them with Jewish people. So, and here you have the role of this kind of crypto-Jewish memory guiding them in this religious change. And here you have this Marrano or this new Christians ideas emphasizing the importance of the Jewish blood in the ethnic constitution of Brazilian national identity. This is you have historians such as Anita Novinsky, Nathan Vastel, really enforcing and doing serious historical research, trying to uncover this kind of Jewish element within a Brazilian nationality and this kind of Brazilian Jewish cultural identities. And even Gilberto Freire in The Masters and Slaves, he has stated that for the better or worse, the Jewish blood is a component of mixed Brazilian national identities because of the connection. And here you have the work of Sá, reminding us that Portuguese descent is also mixed, or is tainted by Jewish blood, the Semite blood. So there is the whole kind of this imaginary in which that somehow being Brazilian is also being a bit Jewish here. There is this dimension in the community I work with. So one of the leaders he's trying to explore this dimension. So Brazil was colonized by the Portuguese. This is a sermon in the synagogue that and a substantial number of them were Jews escaping the Inquisition. To avoid persecution, they changed their names. According to some Jewish writers, 70% of Brazilian population has Jewish ancestry. So, and then he explores how they will not be accepted by the mainstream Jewish communities, but they wanted to live or do what their forefathers were, Jews, and for them, this filiation with this kind of recovered Jewish past is very important. Okay, now it's time to when I normally present that, you have these questions around, are they wanting to migrate to Israel? What kind of rights they want to, by doing, mobilizing this Jewish identity? Are they having any kind of gain? So, and here, the concept of ethnogenesis that is very dear for us Latin Americanists. Now, that is normally refers to the processes related to the development of new identities, and the invasion of ethnicities that are already established can be useful. So normally, and you have the amazing work of Veronique Boyer, and she works actually with the idea of the identity of caboclos. How these ethnogenesis are also a way that one can get recognition and citizenship through ethnic label, and also have access to ethnic territory rights. So there is this whole discussion, and you have some cases of the kind of Jewish ethnogenesis that we could call. One example is the group of the Bnei Menashe. The Bnei Menashe, they were former Christians that went through the process of being accepted by the Orthodox Jewish community. So they converted to Judaism, and through this process of being reconnected with the Jewish people, and you have a whole kind of biblical connection that they make a narrative. I can talk about this later, but they gained the right to do the aliyah, to go and live in Israel. So when I present my case, people are just wondering, okay, it's another group that is wanting this. Well, what I found that ethnogenesis here does not apply to the Judaizing evangelical case. Well, first of all, they don't wish any kind of a request of migratory rights. There is no desire to be recognized by mainstream Judaism. This is very important. They don't want to be accepted because they still hold very Christian kind of, in their theology, Christianity is very strong. So they are not interested in this kind of, in the mobilization of this Jewish identity. On the contrary, there is a lack of encouragement of migrate to Israel through the aliyah or former conversion, because they see themselves as being the kind of a prophetic, having this prophetic role within Christianity, in which they will reform Christianity through Judaism, and their role will be actually in Brazil, spreading all these messages in terms of Judaism.
Manuela, would you like to wrap up now?
Yes. So, in this, okay, it's not an ethnogenesis case. So how can we define this? Here, I would like to explore a bit about the mestiçaje, this kind of national identity that one finds in Brazil, that you have a whole kind of idea that we have this common national mestizo identity, the racial democracy, or the melting pot for the Americans now, that was, you have many intellectuals that put forward this claim. And in the late kind of couple of decades more, I think 50 years, you have a kind of shift to identity politics and multicultural frame coming to Brazil. And from this shift, now we can, this is one of my arguments. So these groups are making use of this shift in terms of seeing this emergence of this multicultural discourses, having this growth of ethnic awareness, and promoting this acceptance of a diverse realities in a society that was previously seen as homogeneous. So before you had the racial democracy, everyone was, the same kind of Brazilian national identity, but now you have the right, or you can rethink your identity. Well, I suggest that the recent shift from the mestizaje paradigm to the multicultural framework has influenced not only the rise of ethnic groups with clear social political demands, but also other groups of people longing for an ethnic identity. And this is what I found among the Judaizing evangelicals. So they are not interested in this kind of rights demands or sustaining, but I found this desire of having this ethnic locus here being important, and this self-identification with Judaism. So, and here an example of this finding an ethnic locus. For example, in our field times, we don't play football. So we keep our identity in our field time. We cultivate our roots. We want to be the Maranos, the B'nai Anassim, and all that. Well, the conclusion, as I was told, we millions of Oliveiras, Pereiras, and Brazilians, we do not know who we truly are. I know that my dad's and my family is from Portugal, and I have a Jewish heart. That is why everything in Judaism is clear to me. We want to know and live who we are. So, and here we have this shift from the mestizaje to the multicultural discourses, opening up this place in which people can long for an ethnic identity. And this case is a religious and ethnic group. Yeah, thank you so much. Sorry.
Thank you. Muito obrigada, Manuela. That was an excellent and very informative presentation. Thank you to all of the panelists.
Welcome everyone to the third webinar panel of the series, Reimagining Belonging. In this panel, we will discuss challenges to legal definitions of status. Before we begin, I wanted to thank the Institute of Modern Languages Research, the Center of Latin American and Caribbean Studies, and the Institute on Statelessness and Inclusion. And we all owe our greatest gratitude to Dr. Eve Hayes de Calaf in organizing us at such a complicated time. This is really, we've been to several statelessness fora in which we convene in person, and in fact Zoom enables us to have a much more global participation, and also it's complicated to organize us. So thank you so much for doing this. My name is Amanda Flame. I am an assistant professor at James Madison College of Public Affairs at Michigan State University, and I'm really delighted to host this panel of speakers. We're joined by Antonio Windrush, Veronica Overlid, Agustin Grandes, and Lucia Santos. Before we begin our presentations, I'd like to alert everyone to the format of the webinar. Please note that each speaker will speak for 15 minutes, and I will politely interrupt when you have 5 minutes left and then remind you when it's time to close. And then after the presentations, we'll have hopefully a lively Q&A discussion. As the speakers are speaking and presenting, I invite all of the participants to register your questions or comments by using the chat function, or you could send me a private message. You're also absolutely invited to wait until the end of the presentations to raise your hands and be recognized during the Q&A discussion. So I invite the presenters to begin.
Hello, my name is Agustin Grandes. I'm a law professor of the law faculty in the University Católica of Peru. With me is Lucia Santos. She is the assistant professor of the legal clinic in identity rights. And today we're going to do a presentation about recognition of gender identity and non-binary identities in Peru. First, I would like to say hello to all the attendees, and thanks to the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies and the Institute of Statelessness and Inclusion for the invitation to be a part of this event and present with Lucia part of the work that the Legal Clinic in Identity Rights has done in the subject of gender identity. The Legal Clinic in Identity Rights, it's an initiative of the Law School of the Pontificia Universidad Católica del Perú, that since 2013 has put a focus on the importance on identity rights in Peru and the need to involve students in real cases and human rights issues. Gender identity is a key component of the legal work and of that we do in the legal clinic, that includes strategic litigation, research, advocacy work, and trying to connect with the students with the reality and the problems that we face as a country in the subject of identity rights. As a part of the work that we do, gender identity is a key component of our work, and this presentation includes some of the problems and challenges that transgender people face in Peru. So now I'm going to give Lucia the chance to present herself and some of the work that we have been doing.
Hi, my name is Lucia. I'm the assistant professor of the clinic. So, well, let's start with some key definitions in order to understand some of the topics we're going to be talking about. We have gender identity, intersexuality, and non-binary. To begin, we must understand that we're talking about identities that defy heteronormativity, and by that defy the very basis of our social and legal systems. The law was not built by or for non-heterosexual cis people. So what we do through advocacy work is to use the tools and concepts that the law gives us to achieve a right guaranteeing interpretation. Of course, this has its limitations, as we will see. According to case law, when we talk about gender identity, we're talking about one's innermost concept of self as male, female, blend, or neither. How we perceive ourselves, or what do we call ourselves, right? Generally speaking, a cis person identifies with the sex assigned at birth, and a trans person does not. Of course, as I mentioned before, a person may not even identify as male or female. Non-binary identities, by definition, are outside of the gender binary system. Now, when we talk about intersex, we're referring to people who are born with both or neither reproductive sexual anatomy. It means that does not seem to fit the typical binary notions of female and male. The recognition of gender identity imposed a first challenge to the law, the recognition that people have a static and a dynamic identity. Through jurisprudence, it was established that while biological characteristics of sexual identity of a person were, I'm sorry, can you hear me? I think there's a problem with the sound, I don't know. As I said, through jurisprudence, it was established that while biological characteristics and sexual identity of a person were invariable, self-perception and gender identity could vary. Now, non-binary identities posed a second challenge. We're no longer talking about people who do not identify with the sex assigned at birth, but of people who defy the binary categories recognized by the law. Yeah, sure, I could switch off the camera. Maybe that way you'll hear me better. Okay. In response to this solutions as the third gender box are being implemented in some countries across the globe. Now, intersexuality poses a third challenge to the law. Maybe the biggest one yet. It's forcing the law to recognize that biological characteristics and sexual identity, things that were once believed to be binary, static, immutable, and defined, are not so. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little about the transgender people and their situation in Peru. In Peru, transgender people experience shocking amounts of violence and discrimination, with the racialized transgender women being the most vulnerable. Hate-motivated killings, as well as arbitrary arrests and beatings perpetrated by the police, are unfortunately very common. They also experience higher rates of unemployment and poverty than any other group in the LGBTIQ community. The employed population revealed that they have suffered some type of discrimination and or violence at work. 33% of the group were not paid what they were promised. 30.8% were made to work day and night, and 24.9% were physically, verbally, or sexually assaulted. They are also among the most particularly vulnerable people to the sanitary and economic crisis caused by COVID-19. So, Agustin, you can take it from here.
To put a context in the Peruvian reality of gender identity, it's important to emphasize that Peru is part of the American Convention on Human Rights and has accepted the contentious jurisdiction of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. That in their jurisprudence has established the protection and guarantee of gender identity under American Convention of Human Rights. So we can check on the slide some of the decisions made by the Inter-American Human Rights Courts regarding the recognition of gender identity as a category under protection of the Human Rights American Convention. Rifo y Niñas versus Chile, Duque versus Colombia, and the Advisory Opinion 2417. Peruvian Constitution has established that human rights treaties are part of the constitutional rights, and therefore, the jurisprudence of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights can be used in Peruvian courts. Additional to this, the Constitutional Court of Peru, in the case of Ana Romero Saldarriaga, using the framework of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, has established that gender identity is a key component of the right of identity and has a constitutional protection. So the lingering question is, if there is a legal framework that recognizes gender identity, what is the remaining legal problems that transgender persons must deal with in Peru? So let's check some of those problems. The case of Ana Romero Saldarriaga mandated that all the claims to change sex and name in Peruvian jurisdiction must follow a judicial procedure. Even though the case of Ana Romero Saldarriaga was an advance of the recognition of gender identity, this mandate to follow a judicial procedure, despite that the Constitutional Court has the possibility to exhort Congress to legislate an administrative procedure, became a problem because of time and because of there were not a clear path for emphasized by the Constitutional Court on how should civil procedures should follow these type of cases. The data that we have, that is data collected until 2019, reveals that a case of this type takes around 3 years, and in most cases represent a re-victimization of transgender persons, because most of the judges in the civil procedure put a lot of emphasis in proof, in make proof of how your identity doesn't match your biological identity, and how the idea of afflictions to the right has to be proved. So there is a lot of resistance by the judges in the civil procedure to actually recognize the identity of a transgender person. They mostly put a focus on the change of name, but the change of sex still is a category that most judges don't want to change in a civil procedure. Another problem that we face is this legal culture that put emphasis in written legislation. The lack of legislation on gender identity has made it impossible to uphold the protection guarantee of the right to identity of transgender persons. The public office of civil registration does not allow the change of name and sex, an administrative procedure, and there has not been an effort from public institutions to comply to the international and national jurisprudence. The role of the public office of civil registration that we call RENIEC by the name of the institution here in Peru, it's also a big problem because RENIEC participates in the judicial proceedings as an adversary, because the civil procedure that the Constitutional Court mandated was an adversary procedure. It has to, and it has a regular practice to appeal all of the first instance judicial decisions that authorize the change of name and sex of a transgender person. The reasons presented in these appeals by RENIEC are usually the same. They say that the legislation does not allow the change of name and sex of transgender persons, that there is a lack of proof that certify the infringements of rights, and also that their legal mandate is to procure the defense of civil registration of any type of change. And also one of the worst reasons that they claim in their appealings is that gender identity is part of the feelings of a person, and because of that, feelings cannot have a legal status. So there's this gap between the formal recognition that the Inter-American Court gave to gender identity and the formal recognition that gender identity received in the Constitutional Court, and how actually this materialized in the recognition of gender identity by the civil procedure and also by public institutions. So what are the pending issues in this topic? The case of Ana Romero Saldarriaga brought a glance of hope of the recognition of transgender identities in Peru. Sadly, the reality and the legal culture of the Peruvian institutions had made it impossible to apply the legal framework that gives protection and guarantees gender identity as a right. In 2016, the first bill of gender identity was presented by Congresswomen Indira Wilka and Marisa Glave. That bill was not discussed by the Congress Commissions of Women and Constitution until 2021, like just a month ago. The path for the bill to be passed is at least murky because of the current and future constitution of the Congress that is mostly conservative in this issue. Non-binary identities and intersex identities have not been incorporated in the Bill of Gender Identity and in the jurisprudence that mostly focus on a binary idea of gender identity. The possibilities of strategic litigation as a way to incorporate recognition of intersex and non-binary identities, it has been explored. For example, our legal clinic is waiting for the final decision in the case that we initiated in 2018 regarding the recognition of identity of an intersex person. If the court rules in our favor, it will be the first case that brings the issue of intersex persons in Peru. But the challenges to uphold this judicial decision in the public sphere will be similar to those faced by transgender persons after the Ana Romero Saldarriaga case. The data that we have until 2019 shows that after this jurisprudence of the case of Ana Romero Saldarriaga, 140 cases were presented to courts in order to adequate the gender identity of transgender persons in their identity documents. But only 9 by 2019 has finished all the judicial process. And from those 9 cases, only 4 were claimed as a valid, only 4 decisions were claimed as valid by the court. So it is a problem that we face, that even though we have very progressive jurisprudence, this jurisprudence has not translated to the actual recognition of gender identity in the country. The legal culture that prioritized written legislation put a limit on the extent of what strategic litigation can impact in the recognition of gender identity in all their diversity. The challenge is to incorporate to the strategic litigation a focus on legislative initiatives and the change of administrative procedures that can close the gap between the formal recognition that we can see in the jurisprudence and the effective guarantee of gender identity as a right. I don't know, Lucia, if you want to add something to this?
No, that's pretty much it.
Well, thank you all for the attention.
Well, that was remarkable. You had another. I was leaving an extra minute and a half given the sound issues. So thank you both. Let's see here. Thank you, Augustin and Lucia, for that illuminating presentation on the recognition of gender identity and non-binary identities in Peru. Non-binary and trans issues are so understudied in the field of statelessness, and your work is making truly significant contributions to our collective ability to queer the state and queer statelessness studies. So thank you, and I look forward to the comments and questions that will come out of this. So next, I'd like to welcome Antonia Windrush to introduce yourself and present your work on diasporic citizenships and contested identities in the Anglophone and Francophone Caribbean, from Windrush to the Bumidom.
Thank you very much, Amanda, and thank you also to Eve for organising such a fantastic conference. The papers have been really wonderful so far, so thank you very much. So I am a Leverhulme Early Career Fellow in the Department of Modern Languages and Cultures at the University of Liverpool. And my postdoctoral project examines cultural responses to post-war migration from the French Caribbean islands of Guadeloupe and Martinique to mainland France. And today I'm going to be focusing on diasporic citizenship and contested identities in Anglophone and the Francophone Caribbean. So it's a comparative perspective from Windrush to the Bumidom. So the 22nd of June 2018 marked the 70th anniversary of the arrival of the Empire Windrush ship, which brought some 500 people from Jamaica to Tilbury Docks, and which heralded the beginning of mass Caribbean migration to Britain. The 22nd of June 2018 was also the first National Windrush Day, and various cultural events to celebrate the contributions of the Caribbean community to British life were held across the country. And yesterday was in fact the third Windrush Day. However, in 2018, these celebrations were eclipsed by the so-called Windrush Scandal. The Home Office's hostile environment policy, which was introduced officially in 2012, sought to make life so difficult for undocumented migrants, including those from the Caribbean Commonwealth who had arrived legally in the 40s and 50s, that they would be forced to leave. The policy tasked employers, landlords, and medical services with enforcing immigration checks. And people were forced to find excessive levels of documentation to prove that they had the right to remain in the UK, while the Home Office destroyed thousands of landing cards, documents which would have helped people to prove that they had the right to remain in the UK legally. Those without sufficient documents were placed in immigration detention centres, and a minority were even deported to countries that they had left over half a century ago. Despite the introduction in April 2019 of the Windrush Compensation Scheme and the publication in March 2020 of the Windrush Lessons Learned Review, the Windrush generation is still waiting for an official apology for the way the Home Office has treated them. And on this slide, you can see some images of the story which was broken in The Guardian by journalist Amelia Gentleman. And Amelia Gentleman has also written a book, The Windrush Betrayal, Exposing the Hostile Environment, in which she explains more about how she became aware of this scandal. So this paper examines debates on migration and citizenship, comparing the situation of Caribbean communities who have settled in Britain and in France. Like Britain, France encouraged workers from the Caribbean to migrate to the metropole to plug the labour gap following the Second World War. In fact, in the French case, the government was actively involved in recruiting workers from the French Caribbean islands of Guadeloupe and Martinique, as well as also from French Guiana and Réunion, through the BUMIDOM. And the translation of what this stands for is the Bureau for the Development of Migration from the Overseas Departments. The BUMIDOM was formally established in 1963, meaning that mass Caribbean migration to France arrived a little later than its British counterpart. In both cases, however, people arriving from the Caribbean were not immigrants, strictly speaking, but they were British or French citizens. The 1948 British Nationality Act meant that Caribbean peoples arriving in the mid-20th century were no longer colonial subjects, but were citizens of the UK and colonies. Meanwhile, the 1947 departmentalisation law meant that Guadeloupeans and Martinicans were, and remain to this day, French citizens. So just to clarify that Guadeloupeans and Martinicans had always been able to travel to mainland France because they were French citizens, but in April 1963, this was really formalised by this BUMIDOM scheme in a form of labour recruitment, effectively. So engaging with the concept of diasporic citizenship, this paper argues that people of Caribbean origin have been continuously attributed a migrant identity in France and in Britain, as they were refused the rights that their citizenship should have granted them. Elena Barbarentseva and Claire Sutherland remind us that citizenship is a highly political notion, which involves much more than simply giving someone the right to remain in a country. I quote, "Citizenship is a marker of identification, dividing the society into those who belong there and those who belong somewhere else. In the case of Caribbean communities in Britain and France, the lack of recognition of their citizenship means that often they feel that they do not belong anywhere at all." So national identity refers to the inherent connection of individuals with their country of origin, as experienced through shared historical and cultural traditions, moral values, and beliefs. And there's a lot of theory on this from different perspectives, from primordialists and perennialists, who believe that nations are stable constructs which have existed over a long period of time, to modernists who depict nations as modern concepts created by elites in response to particular changes, political changes during the 19th century, to postmodernists who see the nation as contemporary expressions of new patterns of identity, and to constructivists and instrumentalists who perceive the nation as social constructs created to emphasize boundaries between members of the group and outsiders. What many of these theorizations have in common, though, is that a nation is a racially and ethnically homogeneous entity, and that an individual can only belong to one nation. So what happens in the case of migration? How is national identity reconfigured by the arrival of migrant communities? And how does this work in the case of Caribbean peoples in Britain and in France, where migrants are also British and French citizens? So the concept of diasporic citizenship is helpful here, because it challenges the assumption that there is a unilateral relationship between a particular group and the territory in which this group has formed a community. It recognises that people often maintain multiple identities deriving from place and ethnicity, but also from the multiple migrations they undertake throughout their lives. In Diasporic Citizenship, Haitian Americans in Transnational America from 1998, Michel Laguerre defines diasporic citizenship as follows, and you have the quotation on the slide. So the concept of diasporic citizenship adds a transnational aspect to the classic definition of citizenship. We conceive of diasporic citizenship as a situation of the individual who lives outside the boundaries of the nation state to which he or she had formerly held primary allegiance, and who experiences through transnational migration, or the redesign of the homeland boundaries, the subjective reality of belonging to two or more nation states. Diasporic citizenship includes both national and transnational outlook, attachment, and commitment. So for Laguerre, diasporic citizenship allows individuals to hold political, social, economic, and cultural ties with more than one nation state. Here, he's examining the specific case of Haitian Americans who migrate to the US, so outside the boundaries of the nation state of Haiti, who maintain connections with Haiti, the US, and potentially with other nation states with which they may become involved following further transnational migration. So is this concept appropriate for diasporic Caribbean communities from Guadeloupe and Martinique who emigrate to the nation state of France, or for people moving from former British colonies to the UK? Indeed, Robin Cohen raises the issue of whether people from the Anglophone and the Francophone Caribbean can be accurately defined as diasporic communities at all, because, and I quote, "they did not suffer a trauma in the Caribbean resulting in their dispersal," a key component of theorizations of diaspora, but he then goes on to say that they do, in fact, can be considered a diasporic group. So if the Caribbean islands themselves are reconfigured as a form of nation state, as Michaela Perina suggests, it seems that this concept is appropriate for French overseas citizens who migrate to France. They are French citizens and are thus keen to form political, economic, and cultural ties with mainland France to assert their rights as French citizens. But they are also simultaneously Caribbean communities, and they wish to retain this affiliation to the Caribbean. Yet in the case of many Bumidum participants, this diasporic citizenship was denied to many of them by the institutionalized racial prejudice ingrained in French society, which I will go on to explain shortly. In the British context, the extent to which the Windrush generation and their families identify as diasporic citizens is perhaps generational. Older members of the community who did live in the Caribbean at some point in their lives are perhaps keener to retain these diasporic connections to the Caribbean, while younger people born and brought up in the UK consider Britain their only home. This concept of diasporic citizenship highlights the fact that these Caribbean communities were entitled to emigrate to the metropole as citizens. And of course, they then have a particular relationship with the nation state. I do not wish to imply by this that their legal status means they deserve superior treatment to those who do not hold French or British citizenship at the time of their migration. Yet it is important to stress that their citizenship should have given them a degree of legal protection, but they have been forced to navigate a whole host of political and social issues in the metropole. So Caribbean migration and citizenship, a comparative perspective. Migration towards and away from the Caribbean and within the region itself is not a new phenomenon. From the immigration of European settlers during the colonial era, to the forced migration of enslaved African peoples in the transatlantic slave trade, and the indentured labour of Asians following abolition, to the more recent phenomenon of labour migration to Europe and the Americas during the 20th and 21st centuries, migration has undoubtedly shaped the course of Caribbean history. This migration is very much tied to European colonial histories. The communities settling in Britain were predominantly from Jamaica, Trinidad, and Barbados, which were part of the British Empire until their independence in 1962, in the case of Jamaica and Trinidad, and 1966 in the case of Barbados. Caribbean communities arriving in France came from Guadeloupe, Martinique, and to a lesser extent, French Guiana. And these are territories which were French colonies until 1947, when they were converted into French overseas departments. And so people in the overseas departments of Guadeloupe and Martinique had the same rights and responsibilities as people who live in departments in mainland France. Yet what sets 20th century migration from the Caribbean islands to France and to Britain apart is the timescale of these arrivals. So mass migration to Britain surged during the Windrush years between 1947 and 1962. And this is not an official designation, but it is loosely used to refer to this period. In the French context, it began 16 years later and slowed down in 1982. Yet some parallels can be observed at the turn of the 20th century.
Just a reminder, you have 4 minutes. I'm sorry.
Okay, thank you. So World War I was a crucial moment in bringing soldiers from the Caribbean to mainland France. During the interwar years, we see middle-class intellectuals and students arriving and settling in Paris, and also in Britain, although this was a more heterogeneous community. After World War II, the migration trends did diverge somewhat, but both countries were in urgent need of workers. Firstly, Britain looked to its Commonwealth countries for this labour, including to the Caribbean. And the first ships arrived in 1947. So you have the SS Ormond arriving in April and the Amanthor arriving in December. Yet memories of these arrivals have been overshadowed by the arrival of the Windrush. And the Windrush has actually become a metonym, which stands for post-war migration. Initially, migration was slow, so around 1,000 to 2,000 people per year in the early 50s, but later on we see this number increase. And in the post-war era, France encouraged European labourers because it was thought that they would easily integrate into French society. But in the early 50s and 60s, they had turned to other European countries, and so France was forced to recruit from the French Caribbean islands. And this is when the Bumidum was implemented. Significantly, the Bumidum was implemented in 1963, only a year after the Commonwealth Immigrants Act 1962 was passed in Britain, which curtailed free movement for citizens of Commonwealth countries by limiting migration. So remarkably, the UK was restricting immigration from the Caribbean at the same time as France was actively orchestrating it. But we can see a difference in constitutional situation here. So France was encouraging migration from its overseas departments, which were an integral part of the French Republic. Yet the UK was limiting immigration from the Caribbean at a time when these Caribbean islands were becoming independent nations, which meant that they could enact their own citizenship laws. Ian Patel argues that there remained an imperial logic to British immigration policies. Decolonisation and the end of empire did not mean stopping immigration from the Commonwealth completely, but stopping a particular kind of immigration, the arrival of non-white British and non-white Commonwealth citizens. So as Patel explains, immigration legislation in the 60s introduced various technical legal distinctions in order to uphold political distinctions of connection and belonging to Britain. So retaining the constitutional structure of the Commonwealth, but preventing non-white citizens from entering Britain without control. But the institutional nature of migration to France was clear. And in fact, the Bumidum was a recruitment agency. It organised the transportation, the recruitment and housing of its young citizens. And this was really done for a range of factors: economic factors, because France needed a strong workforce; demographic issues, because there was high birth rates on the island; and also political factors to reduce political fervour for independence. So while France actively facilitated this mass immigration, Britain was trying to restrict it. And in actual fact, Britain was panicking about an increased Black presence before the ships set sail. The Labour Prime Minister actually tried to divert the ships from arriving. And so we can really see a difference in kind of this situation here.
And time is up, so it's just time to wrap it up.
Yeah, I'll wrap up, thank you.
Sure.
So very quickly then, we can see these differences, but there are some similarities as well in terms of housing. Citizen migrants of the Bumidum were categorised as migrants, so they lost this their rights for citizenship. So although there are very clear differences in the situation of British and French migrants, we can see some similarities too. And very, very quickly, just to wrap up, I would say that it doesn't really seem that the situation has improved very much, and there remains a lot to be done to make sure that these citizens are treated as citizens and not as migrants. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Antonia, for that really informative connection between the British and French colonial and post-colonial cases, and taking a lot of notes. It's been really a wonderful and informative presentation. So last, I'd like to welcome Veronica Overlid to present or give a bit of background on your work and your presentation on the mobility as resistance, challenging the legal definition of a refugee through migrant caravans from Central America. So thank you, Veronica. Welcome.
Hi, thank you so much. And yeah, thank you so much for inviting me to present in this conference. It's great. So I'm a PhD student in law and legal studies at Carleton University in Canada, focusing on the migrant caravans and its implication for international refugee law. I've just recently started scoping a little bit of the initial information. So this presentation will be a little bit about that. So I'm just gonna start here. Let me see. Sharing my screen. Yes, can you see the full one? Perfect, okay. So I changed my title a little bit. Since my findings weren't exactly as I had expected, which very often happens. In this presentation, I'll be looking at Central American migrant caravans from 2018 and 19. My specific focus is the response by the International Organization for Migration, the IOM, and the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, UNHCR, by analyzing reports and press releases that were published by the two agencies in this period. I also aim to consider their engagement with refugee and human rights law, although briefly. So considering the political and economic constraints that these agencies are operating under, I argue that in addition to providing crucial assistance to the caravaneros, they also limited and redirected the caravan's mobility, often contrary to the caravan's own aims. And I also argue that organizations depoliticized the response through the use of human rights and international refugee law discourse, among other things. Let me see it. So in the period of, I'll just start with a little bit of background. In the period of 2018 and 19, several groups of people moved mainly from Honduras, but also El Salvador and Guatemala and some other countries through Mexico, many of them aiming to reach the United States. And only in the fall of 2018, they reached an estimated number of 10,000 individuals, which was followed by consecutive groups the year after. So the caravans were only a fraction of those who yearly attempt to cross the Mexican-US border irregularly, and it's also not a new phenomenon. So these groups are, I would say the caravans are more a reflection of broader displacement and migration trends in the region, although they gained international attention, especially from 2018. And some argue that is because of Trump's response to that. So the people in the caravans move for a number of reasons, such as gang violence, political persecution, environmental issues, poverty, and even family reunification. And the most frequently identified reasons for organizing in caravans relate to the protection that the group structure and visibility can provide, and the reduced need to rely on smugglers. So the caravans were met by a number of actors, each with a variety of agendas and interests. And at first, the Mexican government, for example, issued humanitarian visas, while later, especially due to pressure from the US, it reinforced practices of detention, deportation, and militarization of the southern border. And the encounter with the caravans was fraught with tensions, where some who were assisting the caravans were blamed for furthering their own political gain and even trafficking. So the IOM and UNHCR on their end responded to the caravans by providing humanitarian assistance and also information and assistance related to regulating visa status and how to apply for asylum. And as the caravaneros were often using Facebook in their coordination, the organizations also made use of this portal for spreading information. So they also sought out durable solutions, such as integration into the labor market. Oh, sorry, this was the wrong one. Work permits and local integration into in various locations in Mexico, as well as support for voluntary return, which was IOM mostly. So presumably this work contributed to meeting some of the needs of the caravaneros, as according to the IOM and UNHCR reports, many did not seem to be aware of the process for regularization and asylum application. However, these two UN agencies are also operating within a context in which the US has been placing pressure on Mexico and other countries in the region to help people's movements before reaching the US border. So they're also dependent on voluntary funding, which is also largely from the US in this specific region. And they're also dependent on the goodwill of the host state, in this case, Mexico, in order to continue their operations. So therefore, they're playing a key role in preventing displaced people from reaching the US border. Yet, but maybe not surprisingly, this context is absent from the reports. So therefore, I argue that while assisting people on the move, the IOM and UNHCR are also at the same time contributing to continuing these trends of confining displaced people to either Mexico or in Central American states. So in the context of the caravan, there are several examples of this. So for example, both organizations reported increasing their presence throughout Mexico, rapidly expanding their response in order to address the increased number of people, and set up mobile response teams in several locations along the caravan route. And by this, and also by assisting Mexican authorities with asylum applications and other means of regularization, this surely helped address many of the caravaneros' needs and contributed towards mitigating the dangers and vulnerabilities involved in traveling through Mexico with an irregular status. However, it also had the effect of contributing to the demobilization of the caravaneros and reducing the amount of people moving towards the US border, as they would in this way settle throughout Mexico rather than continuing their journey north. So by employing this narrative that leaves out the context related to why the trajectory is dangerous in the first place, local integration and voluntary return is portrayed as the only reasonable option. An IOM so-called voluntary return program is a case in point where the organization simply states that exhaustion and the challenges ahead have caused many migrants to opt for this. And I find that this removes from sight the migration policies that themselves have partly contributed to the vulnerabilities in the journey. So policies such as, for example, the previous Mérida initiative and Plan Frontera Sur actually increased policing, mass detention, and deportation, and made it even more costly and difficult to cross into Mexico and to continue towards the US. So this is also related to technological advances, as I will explain a bit later on. And this is not to mention the role of the US, both in shaping these policies as well as creating instability and conditions for displacement through historical and recent interventions. And this is precisely the context that the caravans have been responding to, where they strategize to find safer ways to travel north, which the IOM and UNHCR reports say little about. So another example of this is the selective assistance from these agencies, depending on which direction people are willing to move. So in November 2018, around 200 people from one of the caravans staged a protest in front of UNHCR's office in Mexico City, asking the agency to provide buses to help them move towards the US border, which they said would precisely allow them to avoid a risky and exhausting journey. So the following day, the UNHCR and IOM and the High Commissioner for Human Rights issued a statement in response, rejecting the request, as it could be expected, I guess. So the statement highlighted their respective mandates and the work they were doing in favor of the migrant population and their human rights, such as supporting asylum applications and other types of regularization, facilitating durable solutions, and advocating for the Mexican authorities to incorporate international human rights standards. So this unwillingness to provide transportation stands in sharp contrast to the advocacy by the UNHCR towards freedom of movement within Mexico, so that people can move to places where local integration would be more promising. And the same goes for IOM's funding for transportation to those returning, which included transportation mostly by bus, but also sometimes by air, as well as provision of food and psychosocial support, and in many cases, transportation money once they arrived in the respective countries. And while this contradiction is not new, and of course it's related to the diplomatic and political constraints that these organizations are working within, as well as notions of state sovereignty, I argue that the selective obstruction and facilitation of movement still need to enter at least into the equation in order to understand the broader structural framework that these organizations and also the caravans are working or operating within. And it also gives an indication of what international refugee law can or cannot deal with or respond to. And in any case, it suggests the way in which that these organizations shape the mobility of people in a way that is not necessarily aligning with the objectives of those moving. And both UNHCR and IOM reports show that a large part of the caravaneros had no intention of applying for asylum or to regularize their status in Mexico. Although for some, this was indeed, as I mentioned, due to the lack of information about the process.
And Veronica, just so you know, you have 5 minutes.
Okay. Nearly that. However, as scholar Mariana Marchand has argued, for example, there are also anecdotal claims that at least one organization had urged caravaneros not to apply for asylum in Mexico, but to go towards the US in order to make a political statement. So the organization has been blamed for furthering their own political objectives in this way. So there are definitely other factors to take into account here. So I realize. Okay. So the push to have people to regularize their status and support and the support for this has also layers of negative effects as the registration of migrants leads to increased surveillance. And in April this year, the Mexican Commission of Defense and Promotion of Human Rights published a report about the migratory alerts, which is a system of electronic registration and alerts attached to people suspected of having a criminal background. Which is something that spans across several countries in the region. So this alert can be triggered for simply having an irregular status at some point, even in a different country, such as the US. And these are related to a process of modernization. Sorry, I'm just gonna check my notes, of technology. Employed by the National Migration Institute of Mexico, which includes, for example, the collection of biometrics and so on. And this is a result of the collaboration with, for example, the US in the mentioned MERDA initiative. So the alert precludes entry and regularization of status and affects the possibility to apply for asylum. And deportation has often followed. And in case of refugee status, if this has been given already, it can also be revoked based on such an alert. And there have been cases of refugee status removed due to presumed belonging to gangs, although no proofs were put forward in terms of whether they actually did that or belonged to that. So, so the report argues that some of these alerts have been created on the request by the US. And interestingly, there was a stark increase in migratory alerts between 2018 and 2019, which the report finds is partly related to the caravans. So I would like to emphasize that contrary to the claims I made regarding the implication of UNHCR and IOM in redirecting migrants, I do not think that they are implicated in these alerts. And also the UNHCR has actually stated that what has been uncovered in this report is highly concerning and that it works contrary to refugee law and migrants' human rights. But I think it's important to note in order to understand a bit more of the complex web of interest that these organizations like IOM and UNHCR have to navigate, since they are collaborating with the very institutions that are involved in such alerts and funding them. So finally, last point, there are many links that can be drawn to international human rights and refugee law in this context, but I'll limit myself to the discursive use. And in this regard, UNHCR and IOM often refer to refugee and human rights law when addressing the caravans, such as when responding to the bus protesters. And since these agencies claim to be non-political, I still argue that they did make several political choices in the response. So this is partly achieved through leaving out important context. However, I also argue that the discursive appeal to international human rights and refugee law as this neutral way to solve the issue removes from sight the competing and complex interest that drives it. And even UNHCR sometimes didn't necessarily have explicit references to law or who's a refugee and so on. But the response nevertheless operated under assumptions related to questions of sovereignty, deservedness of mobility, who's a refugee, who's a migrant, at least, they're working with specific groups, which is all connected to the law. And considering that these legal instruments are themselves developed in an environment with complex and unequal power dynamics, this suggests that the appeal to law might contribute to the depoliticization of the response and consequently the demobilization or redirection of the caravans, which ultimately affects their access to justice or belonging. Thank you.
Thank you, Veronica. That was really enlightening. And there are a lot of connections. All the applause. There are a lot of connections between the three panels.
So hi everyone, it's great to see that so many of you have hung on till the end of what is the end of the day in the UK. I know it's a lot earlier for those of you joining us from the Americas. It gives me great pleasure to introduce tonight's keynote speaker, who is Professor Wendy Hunter, who is Professor of Government at the University of Texas, Austin. She studies comparative politics with an emphasis on Latin American affairs and has done in-depth work on the military in Brazil and the Southern Cone, as well as research on social policy issues in Brazil and Latin America more generally. Now, Professor Hunter currently works on issues concerning identity, documentation and citizenship in the developing world. She is the author of Eroding Military Influence in Brazil, Politicians Against Soldiers, The Transformation of the Workers' Party in Brazil, Undocumented Nationals Between Statelessness and Citizenship. And she also co-edited a number of different journals. She earned her BA at Cornell University and a PhD from the University of California, Berkeley. So without further ado, over to you and Wendy Hunter, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for that nice introduction, and thank you for inviting me, Eve, to this very stimulating panel, series of panels and conference. I hope to meet you all in person sometime. So I have decided to try to stand above the details and highlight some main themes that I think could stand to be put into sharp relief. I have anticipated some of what the papers this morning have brought out and anticipating tomorrow as well. And then I want to talk a little bit about how, more than many other topics, this whole area of identity, identification, etc., calls for appreciation of interdisciplinary studies and an interdisciplinary approach. So to start, the focus of this conference is really the region of the Americas. And I want to start by saying this region has many, many advantages. And so if these advantages cannot be realized in the form of belonging and inclusion in the Americas, there is a problem. It also suggests that there are many steps that mediate between the huge advantage of a region of some 30-odd countries with birthright citizenship and full inclusion. If that birthright citizenship is not realized in full-fledged citizens. So I would argue that the law of birthright citizenship is merely a starting point, and we need to look at different factors that have been alluded to today, including administrative navigation and social navigation. But hardly anyone is born stateless in the Americas, so that is a huge advantage. However, there are a lot of wrinkles, a lot of complications, and many of them have been talked about today, and I will put them more thematically into stark relief. Okay, so one big boon, but also one big complication, is modernity and the growth of the modern state. That's the first point I want to problematize. Okay, so modern states want to format. Going back to Max Weber, what we've seen is modern states don't like continuum, and they don't deal well with blurred boundaries. And so anything continuous or blurred is going to be likely to be turned into a rigid or binary category under a modern state, whether it is an intersex person or a trans person, or someone who has some claim to citizenship but doesn't have the full package. Okay, so this means that you're either in or you're out. You are given a full membership to the political community or you're not. And so the second point I want to make is something about time. And the time is a time of nation states where the surveillance functions in a world of globalization have turned more extreme, and states have more capacity to surveil. But the inclusion functions are important too. There's actually something to get and things not to receive if you are counted or not counted as a full citizen. So when social policy consisted of patronage and the rancher deciding to give you baskets of food if you kept your head down, those days, they're not over, but increasingly we see welfare states emerging even in very developing contexts. And so if any time you really wanted to be a full-fledged citizen with full documentation, now would be the time. So as Bronwyn Manby eloquently puts in her recent World Development article, the only thing worse than, getting documented is not being documented. This is not a time when you don't want to be documented. But the problem is certain people have blurred kind of claims to full-fledged paperwork and citizenship. And those get turned by the modern state into binary categories of you are in or you are out. So how does this happen? I want to turn now to the role I see for various disciplines to study these sorts of questions that I have just put on the table and that were brought out this morning. The first discipline that I want to draw attention to is history. And I want to start with a very big provocative comment. I think many studies in this area put too much attention on current leaders and discriminatory intent. Okay, they may have discriminatory, exclusionary intent, but history does 3/4 of the work for them. Exclusion is carried in institutions. Institutions carry history forward. Therefore, you can see it as current leaders not having to actually do that much to continue exclusion, or you could also see it as leaders with political will wanting to overcome a history of exclusion have a lot of work to do. They really have to break through history. So Eve brought up this morning the question of demand. Did everybody actually, were they clamming for documents? I think this is an important point to mention. No, in many cases. Why? Because they were scared of the state on the one hand, and there wasn't all that much positive to get out of it. So people on the margins even suppressed the demand for documents. And many states did not come forth with supply because they simply didn't recognize these people. Certain people were targeted for their labor. So the apartheid state was known for this, and they had documents. But if you were not a person of the gentry, or in Latin America into the 40s and 50s, at least middle class, you just didn't have documents. And you could get along that way, and no one got in your way. That is over. That situation is over. But the problem was that history gave us, many people, the situation where they were left without documents. So let me give you, and they suffer to this day because of it. Let me give you a concrete example going to the Dominican Republic. Okay, in residentially segregated areas around cane plantations, many Dominico-Haitians, most Dominico-Haitians, were not born in hospitals in the early decades of the 20th century, and there were not civil registries. Therefore, they had no proof of their birth in a country that supposedly observed birthright citizenship. That put them in a very difficult position when the state in the 90s and onward really wanted to reckon with the question of who's in and who's out. Many of these people, although they were born in the DR and have never been to Haiti in their life, couldn't prove it. Therefore, the state used this exclusion to exclude them in a more kind of legalized fashion. So the role of history is really important on this. The second thing I want to point to is a more political science way of looking at this, but I think political science does have much to offer here too. And a specific institutional setup that is worth drawing attention to is federalism. So Imke Harbers is going to talk about Mexican states, and there's huge differentiation among Mexican states in how well they've included people. There's also a difference in US states. So I'm going to talk for a couple minutes about the US because there's actually no paper given on it. The US is not exempt at all from many of the forms of exclusion that we've talked about today. And federalism is at the heart of the ability of the US, especially southern states, to exclude, and the difficulty of people overcoming this. So if you look at the statistics, into the 40s and 50s, the rate of birth registration was much higher in the northern states and much lower in the states of the Deep South. Who didn't get documented in the Deep South? Precisely the people you might expect. Poor African Americans who were born off the grid. Now, many of those moved north. And so they have had, to this day, a problem actually showing they were born in the United States of America. You have to know the county. In a couple of US states in the South, you have to actually know the county in which you were born to try to piece together some records. Now these people need Social Security. They are in their 70s and 80s, and they are still struggling to get a birth certificate. US federalism and the discrimination of the past makes that harder. In the state of Texas, so I teach at the University of Texas, we have people who joined the US military but can't get a passport. Why can they not get a passport now? Why? Because there's more scrutiny on birth certificates, especially if you were poor and did not have an institutional birth. Your birth certificate in certain states is now being questioned, which hurts your ability to get a passport. So all to say, the institutional setup has been deleterious to many people. Okay, the third discipline I want to call attention to is the law. There's no two ways about it. Legal discrimination is there. It's important. That's why Bronwyn Manby and many people who study this well have a background in the law. But that is not where it stops. It's very important to realize that there's also public administration. Okay, so this is the fourth discipline I want to point to, the whole discipline of the bureaucracy, how public administrations make certain people navigate issues on the ground. And this is really where a lot of people who have legal citizenship get excluded. So again, going back to the birthright concept of the Americas, where 30 some odd countries have birthright citizenship. If you cannot prove it, you may be out. And in a modern era, that means you can be really out. So what is so we need to look at the concept of administrative burdening. Pamela Hurd and Donald Moynihan have written a great book on this. And they talk about how this is a very elusive target of attack because it unfolds across a series of decisions over time. Okay, so here you are, you should be a citizen, you're a legal citizen, except you can't prove it. So you go to the bureaucracy. This is hard to navigate because there have been a number of administrative decisions that are basically giving you the runaround. You're not dealing with a highly visible leader who's going to kind of catch hell in the international community for discrimination. You're dealing with a bunch of faceless bureaucrats. The blame is transferred to these faceless bureaucrats who make these ad hoc decisions, aren't particularly accountable. and many of whom carry very xenophobic ideas themselves. It's very hard to monitor these decisions. Okay, so it's very hard for any outside actors to monitor who's getting in, what are the criteria, how fair this is. And the other thing to note is many of these proceedings just drag on and on and on, and they wear people down. They wear down people who already have a problem of psychological weariness, and so they give up. So this is one instance in which the law does not translate into a positive outcome of full citizenship, but rather you have undocumented nationals. And in a modern era, that's not too much worse than being completely an undocumented and a foreigner. So I'd like to draw your attention to this complexity and the discipline that would help us understand this. Kind of bureaucratic runaround and psychological wearing down. It also wears down the international community because they can't keep monitoring it and don't have easy access to where the decisions really are taking place. And they're on the ground in the dark corners of bureaucracies, not in high courts. Okay, I think we're up to 5. The area I think more work needs to be done in, and it was briefly alluded today with respect to Mexico and international commissions. There's a whole realm of international advocacy that I think we need to look more seriously at. Most modern states want some claim to legitimacy. Most modern states do not want to be international pariahs. Maybe China can be an international pariah because it's big and important. Maybe India can get close to that. But the Dominican Republic, Colombia, Peru are in no position to just defy the international community. And so I think it's interesting to look at some of the subtle ways in which these countries react. So a subtle way in the DR was to make, in 2013, the DR Tribunal made this outrageous, egregious, retroactive denial of citizenship to many Dominico Haitians because their parents and grandparents did not have documentation. The heat that they got for this was so great from the strongest international court or regional court, which is the Inter-American court system, that they backtracked in 2014 and said, okay, well, you all can be citizens if you can jump through all these hoops, most of which were so onerous that most people could not jump through. However, this took the heat off the country, and it did not resolve the problem. But if you look at the media, for example, the media posts on the DR, they go down after this 2014 kind of walking back of the egregious 2013 ruling. Again, it did not solve the problem. There are thousands of people, Dominico Haitians, who are in limbo. But the quest for legitimation took the heat off here. Even Modi, if you look at Narendra Modi's move of 2019, basically the Muslims in the state of Assam have been discriminated through a national citizenship register. And there's a sense that it will travel to Muslims of other states. His reaction was to very quickly make policies so that people of other religions could come in, Christians, Buddhists, what have you, to India. I read this as some response to the international community. Again, it doesn't help Muslims that Christians can come into India, but you see, again, a response. In Kenya, for example, they decided to suddenly give citizenship to small groups like the Makonde in Pemba. The big group, the 6th largest tribe in the country, are Kenyan Somalis. They have a very hard time, not only because of border issues and security issues, but out and out discrimination. And it doesn't help that many of them are not legally Kenyan citizens, but many are, okay, but many are. So I think the foreign policy aspect of this deserves much more attention. And then we have a whole realm for culture and society, so anthropology and sociology. If you look at a country like Bolivia and Peru, by the way, that has done a very admirable job at bringing people in as fully documented citizens under very difficult situations. Post-Sendero wartime in the case of Peru, but in the case of Bolivia, low technology, many indigenous languages, very difficult weather. There's fewer births registered in the winter simply because it's very hard. Naming practices. We see that cultural discrimination and sociological discrimination really did play roles in the past in keeping down demand and keeping down supply. What you got in the last 20 years was a push to go the last mile and not be content with birth registration and ID being left at something like 70%, but bringing in many Bolivians in rural areas, people who don't speak Spanish, etc., but through an appreciation of culture and sociology. Like you can go into a registration office, even in La Paz, and there will be on the ground people who speak Aymara and Quechua, and are very supportive of people who have not had much contact with the state, and in an effort to bring them in. By contrast, for example, in Paraguay, despite Guarani being recognized as an official language, there are still these customs, like you can't name a person after an animal. That's actually in the registration booklet. Well, that may be an indigenous custom, but you can't do it. So that would be a case where I think there hasn't been enough openness to really bring in people as full citizens. The other thing I wanted to mention is that there is a role for technology here. Okay, I do think we need to recognize that technology can be in the service of development and inclusion. If you go to Bolivia and you see how how sparsely populated the place is, and really how poor it is, you can appreciate that maybe this mobile phone midwife experiment they are doing might have a role to play. Brazil has made vast strides in birth registration, and it's partly through satellite technology, bringing computers and satellites into the Amazon via the river system. And in one fell swoop, you can go from trying to register your birth 70 years after it happened to a social worker / registrar trying to sign you up for a rural pension. That is all linked up to Brasilia. In the absence of technology, that would not be happening. If you study Peru, and we have some Peruvians here, you have to appreciate that Sendero Luminoso burned down a ton of state offices, including civil registries, in an era in which all registration for many people was totally paper. You probably can appreciate the role of digitization so that people's whole identification system was not wrapped up in analog paper IDs. So technology has a huge role to play. That said, I think we're going to hear tomorrow, and we need to hear, that you can't plunk down a fancy modern biometric system that claims to be all-inclusive on top of a historical infrastructure that was built in a way that it excluded many people. So we've seen in Kenya, for example, that the biometrics experiment of ID depended on people showing their prior ID. How is that supposed to include more people? The people who didn't have ID in the past didn't get in on the system. It was so disastrous, they actually stopped it. And so it's hard for me to imagine that the tech people weren't brought in and made sensitive to the historical infrastructure on which they were building this new fandangled ID system. So I think that's a very important point to mention. I think we're going to see the limits of technology tomorrow, but I did want to make a plug to salvage the idea that there definitely is a role for modern technology, as well as history, people who appreciate the politics of this, and anthropologists who appreciate the culture and the sociology of this. So to conclude, I want to just talk about a couple of cases that bring together how complex and interdisciplinary the appreciation has to be in order to bring in the last mile, go the last mile being the last third of the population or even half of the population in some instances. So I think Bolivia has performed very admirably on this. Brazil is a case, so I'm a Brazilianist by training, is a case of a country that I think had no excuse for being as bad as it was until the mid-1990s. Until the mid-1990s, 1/3 of all children did not get their births registered until they were 5 years old. Now, Brazil is considered an upper middle income country. It has a great informatics. It has a tremendous public health system, the Programa Saúde da Família. There was really no excuse for Brazil to be down where it was on documentation. But there wasn't a whole lot of political will, partly because social policy was the realm of patronage. So you didn't need documents to get into the system. And it was also, continues to be a country just of status distinctions. There were people who counted and people who didn't count, and in the eyes of the government, and everyone who counted was documented. So Brazil in the mid-1990s finally did start making progress. And because they have the infrastructure and the technocracy they were able to really accelerate history. So that's interesting. I think the people since 1990 need to be commended for that. But I think Bolivia is really a case worth looking at because it had many issues going against full documentation. So I'm talking about beginning with the birth certificate and then moving into the national ID. This is a hard country. It's a very poor country. It's highly indigenous, and many indigenous people didn't want documentation because they thought it would expose them to the state. It's very sparsely populated. The terrain is very, very difficult. There have been a very large share of non-institutional births, partly just due to lack of infrastructure and wealth, but partly due to cultural fear of being in contact with the state, because most indigenous people didn't have a great interaction with the state when they did encounter it, and then just very low technology. Bolivia in the last 20 years, though, has closed the gap on birth registration such that they are now in the 90s, 92, 93 percentile. So that's making up a share of about 30%, 35% in the space of a couple decades. I want to stress that there was political will here. Okay, so this is very voluntaristic, but you know what? Some things are voluntaristic. Bolivia made the decision. It was going to go for it and develop a welfare state to the extent it could and recognize citizens. I think much of this started prior to Evo Morales. However, I think Morales was able to get many indigenous people on board because he was one of them. Now, some of his things were a bit heavy-handed, like paying women to give. In the US, with the libertarian culture, this would be seen as heavy-handed, paying women to give birth in a hospital and not giving you the money if you didn't, paying you to get your child registered. It actually worked. In any case, what we see in the Bolivian case is the legal framework was there. There is birthright citizenship in Bolivia, but the administrative part of it was not there and the social part of it was not there. So if you look at intersecting circles, the legal intersected with the social and then with the administrative, and then the social intersected with all, such that the public bureaucracy helped people walk through the system, okay? They attended to the cultural and sociological fears of people by putting many documents in indigenous languages, but also training many registrars who spoke indigenous languages, not just out in the countryside, but in downtown La Paz. You can go to the main registry and just walk in and they will assist you. Technology has played a role also in Bolivia. They have actually gone back and put all the paper documents into digital form. They have tried to flexibilize their computer program such that people don't have to have the kind of format of modern names. Many people would say, well, I don't have the Spanish, mother's name, father's name. I just have one name. How is that supposed to fit in the computer? They've tried to deal with that as well. And I do want to say they have also tried to decrease the stigma of children without fathers that recognize them. Believe it or not, in many Latin American countries, even Costa Rica into the 70s, there was a blank for father, mother and father, and if you didn't have a recognized father, it would write that you were hijo ilegítimo. Okay, if that's not a disincentive to getting your child a birth certificate, I don't know what is. It was actually seen as a reason many mothers did not seek birth certification for their children. Okay, so on this note of breaking with the past, I do think it's important to emphasize that in cases where progress is made, there has had to be some forgiveness. In the Bolivian case, one problem was many parents did not have IDs. And historically, if your parents could not prove who they were, a kid could not get a birth certificate because how do we know those are really the parents? The Bolivian government finally said, you know what, we're going to relent on this. We'll have witnesses, and these people are who they say they are. The Brazilian government, which has more capacity and had kind of a tougher stand on this, said if the parents aren't documented, we will get them documented. And so basically what I'm talking about is breaking with history and breaking with intergenerational exclusion. But it takes will and it takes some forgiveness. Bolivia also gave people an amnesty. In many countries, you had to pay fines if you didn't register your kid in the past. So guess what? That fine was a deterrent to people of very low income going forth and getting delayed registration. I don't think it takes rocket science to figure out if you give an amnesty, more people will come forth, and that is what happened. Also, in the countries that have made progress, they've simply dropped the fees for on-time birth registration. If you look at how much it costs in terms of lost work time, travel time, etc., the money is important for low-income people. And so this is a little bit of politics, because the cartorios, or notary republics, made a lot of money by charging people. The state has had to step in and say fine, okay, don't ask the people themselves for money, we'll pay you through the state. Another example of forgiveness has been just accepting baptismal certificates as not a proxy for civil registration, but as evidence of birth and who your parents are. Now, I did a lot of work on the DR to try to see what the role of accepting baptismal certificates was, thinking, okay, many of these people are Catholic. Parishes are known for keeping good records. A good, reasonable way to see if these are the parents and this was the date and place of birth was just, rely on the church. It is really hard to find in the DR examples where that has actually been done. And you have to look at, footnote 99 on page 110 to find out that you can even do it as evidence of birth and as an entryway to civil registration. So I think it pays to be, in some, very cognizant of how multidisciplinary the approach to citizenship has to be. And so today I've talked really about my own work in terms of getting the documentation that grants nationality in full-fledged citizenship. We also have to realize that if this cannot be done in the Americas, where birthright still stands in most countries, and it's a matter of what comes after that, imagine how difficult it will be elsewhere. I do think it pays to look at the success cases against the non-success cases and ask, what is happening in the cases of success that's not happening elsewhere? And so I look forward to your questions, and I really look forward to the comments and questions, and I really look forward to the papers tomorrow as well. Thank you.
Oh, Wendy, thank you so much for that fantastic keynote. I'm very happy that you've been able to join us. I do hope, please put your hand up if you've got a question. It'd be great if we could just have a quick discussion for the end of the day. I just wanted to note that I'm very happy that you mentioned the Kenyan case as well, because we've got Karen Weisberg who's talking tomorrow, whose research there has many parallels with my own work. And I especially think that we have a global panel at the end of the day tomorrow, and the aim of that panel is really to show that there are lessons to be learned from other case studies that we're seeing. So thank you so much for that